0 o'clock to 2 o'clock. Cold Open and Rise of Elizabeth Holmes. The year is 2014. Silicon Valley is drunk on its own mythology. Move fast, break things, disrupt everything. And standing at the center of it all is a 30-year-old woman with piercing blue eyes, a voice deliberately dropped 2 octaves, and a black turtleneck that screams one name, Steve Jobs. Her name is Elizabeth Holmes, and she is about to commit one of the most audacious frauds in American corporate history. But here is what makes Theranos different from every other scam you have ever heard of. This was not some back-alley con. This was not a Ponzi scheme hiding in the shadows. This happened in boardrooms, in hospitals, in pharmacies, in the pages of Forbes and Fortune and Time magazine, in front of some of the most powerful men and women on the planet, and every single one of them got played. Theranos, the company that promised to revolutionize medicine with a single drop of blood. The company valued at $9 billion. The company that ran over 200 tests on real patients using technology that simply did not work. This is the story of how one woman convinced the entire world to believe in something that never existed, and what happened to the people who paid the price. 2 o'clock to 4 o'clock, the origin story and the pitch. To understand the con, you have to understand the con artist. Elizabeth Holmes grew up in Washington, D.C., obsessed with success. She wanted to be a billionaire, not a scientist, not a doctor. A billionaire. She said it out loud to her family as a child. Most kids want to be astronauts. Holmes wanted to be rich. She enrolled at Stanford University to study chemical engineering, but in 2003, at just 19 years old, she dropped out. She had an idea, and the idea was seductive in its simplicity. What if you could run hundreds of medical tests from a single tiny drop of blood? No needles plunging into veins, no waiting days for results. Just a pinprick on your finger, a drop of blood, and in minutes a complete picture of your health. Affordable, accessible, revolutionary. She called the device the Edison. She called the company Theranos, a blend of therapy and diagnosis. And she started pitching. Now here is where it gets interesting. Holmes understood something that most scientists do not. She understood the room. She walked into boardrooms full of aging male executives and politicians, men who did not understand microbiology or spectrometry, men who responded to vision and charisma and the ghost of Steve Jobs. She wore the black turtleneck. She spoke in a baritone register she had deliberately manufactured. She looked people dead in the eyes, and she said the words they were desperate to hear. "I'm going to change medicine forever." And they believed her. Because she was young and beautiful and brilliant, and she looked like the future. She did not mention the part where none of it worked. 4 o'clock to 6 o'clock. The investors, the board, and the big money. Let us talk about the money, because the scale of what Holmes built on pure fiction is genuinely staggering. Theranos raised over $900 million in funding, $900 million from real investors, sophisticated investors, people who were supposed to know better. George Shultz, former Secretary of State, joined the board. Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of State. James Mattis, who would later become Secretary of Defense. Rupert Murdoch personally invested $125 million. The Walton family, the DeVos family, some of the wealthiest dynasties in America, poured money in. And here is the darkest irony of all. Holmes refused to let any of them perform standard due diligence. She cloaked everything in the language of trade secrets. The technology is proprietary. You cannot see it. You cannot test it. You just have to trust me. And they did. Why? Because the board was full of generals and diplomats and media moguls. Not a single medical professional, not a single person who could have looked at the Edison device and said, "Wait, this is scientifically impossible." Holmes had built the perfect architecture of deception. Surround yourself with people who are impressive, but ignorant of the very thing they are supposedly overseeing. It is a trick as old as fraud itself, but she executed it at a level that was almost artistic. By 2014, Forbes had declared her net worth at $4.5 billion. She was on magazine covers. She was giving TED-style talks. She was having dinner with presidents. The lie was now so large, so deeply embedded in the fabric of American culture, that challenging it felt almost unpatriotic. 6 o'clock to 8 o'clock. The whistleblowers and the Wall Street Journal. But inside Theranos, people knew. Employees watched as the Edison machine produced wildly inaccurate results. They watched as samples were secretly sent out to conventional Siemens laboratory equipment, while patients were told the results came from Theranos technology. They watched as Holmes and her partner and boyfriend Ramesh Sunny Balwani created a culture of paranoia and intimidation that would make a cult leader proud. Surveillance cameras everywhere. Employees forbidden from discussing their work with each other across departments. A legal team that buried anyone who raised concerns under mountains of non-disclosure agreements. People were fired. People were threatened. One employee described it as working inside a pressure cooker of fear. And then there was Tyler Schultz, the grandson of board member George Schultz. He joined Theranos believing in the mission. He was young, idealistic, and when he ran the numbers and realized the tests were producing dangerously inaccurate results, he did something that took extraordinary courage. He talked to a journalist. John Carreyrou, an investigative reporter at the Wall Street Journal, had started sniffing around Theranos. For months, Theranos unleashed its legal team on him, on his sources, on anyone who spoke to him. They hired private investigators. They pressured publishers. They threatened careers. But Carreyrou kept going. In October 2015, the Wall Street Journal published the story. The Edison device was not running the tests. The technology did not work as advertised. Theranos had been using conventional third-party machines for the vast majority of its tests. The dam broke, and the water behind it was ice cold. 8 o'clock to 10 o'clock, the human cost, where it gets truly dark. Now we need to stop talking about money and investors and magazine covers, because this is where the story stops being fascinating and starts being genuinely horrifying. Real patients, real people, got real test results from Theranos. A woman received a false positive for HIV. She spent days believing she was HIV positive before retesting revealed it was wrong. Days of pure psychological devastation, because a machine that did not work told her something that was not true. Patients received wildly inaccurate results for cardiovascular disease markers, thyroid conditions, cancer screenings. Doctors made medical decisions based on data that was fundamentally unreliable. Some patients were told they had conditions they did not have. Some patients may have had conditions that the faulty tests missed entirely. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services investigated the Theranos laboratory in Newark, California. What they found was damning. The lab posed immediate jeopardy to patient health and safety. In 2016, CMS banned Elizabeth Holmes from operating or owning any clinical laboratory for 2 years. They revoked Theranos laboratory certification. Theranos voided tens of thousands of test results. Tens of thousands of patients received letters telling them their results may have been inaccurate. Imagine receiving that letter. Imagine not knowing if the diagnosis you had been living with for months was real or a product of a machine that was never built to do what it claimed. This is the part that gets buried under the glamour of the fraud story. The human beings, the sick, the worried, the people who walked into a Walgreens pharmacy believing that technology was finally on their side. They were not collateral damage. They were the crime. 10 o'clock to 12 o'clock, the fall, the verdict, and the lesson. The empire collapsed with breathtaking speed. In 2018, the Securities and Exchange Commission charged Elizabeth Holmes and Sunny Balwani with massive fraud. Holmes settled with the SEC, paying $500,000, a fraction of what she had taken, and agreeing never to serve as an officer or director of a public company for 10 years. But the Department of Justice was not done. In June 2018, both Holmes and Balwani were indicted on federal wire fraud and conspiracy charges. The criminal trial that followed became a cultural spectacle. Holmes arrived in court with a new persona, a baby, a soft voice, a devoted partner. She claimed Balwani had psychologically abused her. She claimed she genuinely believed in the technology. In January 2022, the jury delivered its verdict. Elizabeth Holmes was found guilty on 4 counts of criminal fraud. In November 2022, she was sentenced to 11 years and 3 months in federal prison. Balwani received a longer sentence of nearly 13 years. The $9 billion company was worth zero. The $4.5 billion fortune was gone. The black turtleneck was traded for a federal prison uniform. But here is the question that no verdict can answer. How did this happen? How does a fraud of this scale survive for over a decade in a world with regulators and journalists and scientists and supposedly sophisticated investors? The answer is uncomfortable. We wanted to believe her. Silly.